The demon didn't arrive with flames or screams. It came to Saint Teresa's cell wrapped in gentle words, offering what every exhausted soul craves: permission to rest, validation for her sacrifices, whispers that she had already proven herself worthy. The deceiver's whisper targeted not her flesh but her spirit, exploiting the very devotion that made her holy. This is the documented account of how a single entity nearly destroyed one of Christianity's most revered figures, not through violence, but through the most insidious weapon ever crafted: the lie that sounds like truth. What she discovered in that cell changes everything we think we know about spiritual warfare. The cell was cold that evening, stone walls exhaling the dampness of centuries, candlelight trembling against shadows that seemed to breathe with their own rhythm. Saint Teresa knelt on the bare floor, her knees pressed against unyielding rock, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles had turned white as communion bread. She had been praying for hours, her voice hoarse from reciting psalms, her body trembling from exhaustion that had become her constant companion in this life of radical devotion. The convent around her had fallen into the deep silence that comes only after midnight, when even the mice stop their scurrying and the wind holds its breath outside the shuttered windows. In that silence she heard something that shouldn't have been there, a voice so gentle, so filled with warmth, that her first instinct was to believe it came from heaven itself. The words arrived not as sound traveling through air, but as thoughts forming inside her mind with a clarity that felt more real than her own internal dialogue. This was the beginning of an attack so sophisticated, so carefully crafted, that it would take her to the very edge of spiritual destruction before she understood what was happening. The voice spoke with intimate knowledge of her struggles, acknowledging the sacrifices she had made since entering religious life at 20 years old. It knew about the nights she had wept in this very cell, questioning whether her efforts meant anything, whether her prayers reached beyond the ceiling beams. It understood the physical pain that accompanied her devotions, the way her body protested against the disciplines she imposed upon it in pursuit of holiness. The voice didn't condemn these doubts. Instead, it validated them with a compassion that felt like a warm embrace after years of cold spiritual winters. Teresa found herself listening with a hunger she hadn't realized existed within her, a desperate need for someone, something, to acknowledge that the path she walked was almost impossibly difficult. The entity speaking to her seemed to understand every nuance of her interior life, every hidden fear she had never voiced even in confession, every moment of pride she had tried to suppress when she felt herself making spiritual progress. It was this precision, this impossible accuracy, that should have warned her something was deeply wrong. The demon's strategy was masterful in its subtlety, operating on psychological principles that modern manipulators would recognize as textbook grooming techniques. It began by establishing credibility through accurate observations, creating a false sense of safety and understanding. The voice praised her for her devotion, her willingness to suffer for divine love, her commitment to the reformed Carmelite order she was working to establish. Each compliment was carefully calibrated to stroke the hidden pride that exists even in the most humble soul, that secret place where we keep our hope that our efforts matter, that we are special, that we will be recognized for our sacrifices. Teresa had spent years trying to crucify this pride, to nail it to the cross of self-denial, but it remained alive within her like a parasite that feeds on the very attempts to kill it. The voice knew exactly where to find it, knew precisely which words would make it stir and stretch beneath the surface of her conscious awareness. This was not random temptation. This was targeted warfare conducted with surgical precision. What made the attack so dangerous was its foundation in partial truth, the most effective lies always containing enough reality to make them digestible. Teresa was indeed making sacrifices that most people could never comprehend. Sleeping on wooden planks, eating food that barely sustained life, spending hours in contemplative prayer that left her physically and emotionally depleted. She was reforming an entire religious order, facing opposition from church authorities and even members of her own community who found her standards too demanding. The voice acknowledged all of this with a tone of deep respect, positioning itself as the one witness who truly understood what she was enduring. It suggested that perhaps she had proven herself enough, that surely divine love wouldn't demand such constant suffering from someone who had already demonstrated such extraordinary commitment. These words arrived wrapped in comfort, in the promise of relief from a burden that had grown almost unbearable. Teresa felt something within her beginning to soften, a tightness in her chest loosening as permission formed to perhaps ease her disciplines, to grant herself mercies she had long denied. The psychological mechanism at work was the demon's exploitation of spiritual exhaustion, that state where even the most devoted soul becomes vulnerable to shortcuts and compromises. Teresa had been operating at the edge of her capacity for years, pushing herself beyond normal human limits in pursuit of union with the divine. The voice recognized this exhaustion and offered not obvious evil but reasonable moderation, a far more dangerous proposition. It never suggested she abandon her vocation entirely. Such a proposal would have immediately triggered her defenses. Instead, it whispered about balance, about the importance of preserving her health so she could serve for many more years, about how excessive suffering might actually be a form of pride disguised as humility. Each argument was constructed with enough theological sophistication to sound almost orthodox, twisted just enough from true doctrine to lead her towards spiritual destruction while maintaining the appearance of wisdom. This was the signature of the attack. It sounded like the voice of mature spiritual guidance, the kind of counsel a wise confessor might offer to someone teetering on the edge of burnout. The cell around her seemed to change as these thoughts penetrated deeper into her consciousness, the shadows growing warmer, the cold stone less punishing, the candlelight less harsh against her tired eyes. Teresa found herself imagining what it would feel like to sleep in a proper bed, to eat a meal that actually satisfied her hunger, to spend a day without the constant gnawing of self-imposed discipline. The voice encouraged these fantasies, painting them not as indulgences, but as practical necessities for someone undertaking the important work of religious reform. It suggested that her effectiveness as a leader would increase if she weren't constantly weakened by extreme asceticism, that perhaps she had confused suffering with holiness when they were not necessarily the same thing. These arguments felt compelling in a way that terrified some small part of her, that remained alert, even as the rest of her consciousness began to relax into the comfort being offered. That small part recognized something fundamentally wrong in the entire conversation, some quality in the voice that didn't align with authentic divine communication, but exhaustion had made her vulnerable to ignoring warning signs that should have sent her running toward her spiritual director for help and guidance. The attacks continued over several nights, each session building upon the foundation established in previous encounters, creating a psychological structure designed to reshape Teresa's understanding of her own spiritual journey. The demon demonstrated patience that revealed the depth of its commitment to corrupting her vocation, never rushing, never pushing too hard, always withdrawing before her resistance could fully mobilize. This pattern of advance and retreat is classic manipulation, creating a dynamic where the victim begins to anticipate and even welcome the next encounter, their defenses gradually eroding through repeated exposure to the seductive message. Teresa found herself waiting in her cell each evening with a mixture of dread and anticipation, her prayers becoming more distracted as part of her consciousness remained alert for that gentle voice that understood her so completely. The demon was establishing a relationship, creating dependency, positioning itself as the one source of true comprehension in a world where she felt increasingly isolated by the radical nature of her spiritual commitments. This isolation was itself a weapon, one the entity exploited with practiced skill. The voice began to subtly attack her relationships with her spiritual directors and confessors, those human authorities who stood as barriers between the demon and complete access to her soul. It never openly criticized these men. Instead, it planted seeds of doubt about their capacity to truly understand her unique spiritual experiences. The demon suggested that her visions and mystical encounters were so far beyond ordinary religious experience that conventional guidance might actually hinder rather than help her development. It praised her as someone operating at a level of spiritual advancement that required direct divine instruction rather than human intermediation. Teresa felt a dangerous thrill at these suggestions, the same pride she had been fighting suddenly finding validation in what seemed like recognition of her extraordinary spiritual gifts. The entity was isolating her from the very support systems that could have identified and stopped the attack, using her own accomplishments and genuine spiritual experiences as weapons against her. This is a pattern recognizable in any form of predatory manipulation. Separate the victim from those who might intervene, create a special relationship that exists outside normal social structures, convince the target that they are unique and therefore normal rules don't apply. The theological sophistication of the demon's arguments revealed an intelligence that had spent centuries studying human psychology and religious doctrine. It quoted scripture with the ease of a scholar, twisting interpretation just enough to support its agenda while maintaining surface plausibility. When Teresa experienced moments of genuine divine consolation in her prayer, the voice was there immediately afterward to claim credit, to suggest that this comfort came as reward for her willingness to listen to the guidance being offered. It was creating confusion about the source of her spiritual experiences, blurring the lines between authentic divine communication and demonic interference. Teresa found herself unable to distinguish between the two with the clarity she had once possessed, her discernment clouded by exhaustion, isolation, and the steady drip of subtle poison into her consciousness. The demon understood that it didn't need to present itself as evil. It merely needed to present itself as an alternative path to the same destination she was already pursuing. The suggestion was always that it was helping her reach holiness more efficiently, with less unnecessary suffering, through a more balanced and sustainable approach. The attack on her sense of humility was particularly insidious, wrapped as it was in apparent praise and recognition. The voice constantly reminded her of her spiritual accomplishments, her mystical visions, her theological writings, her leadership in religious reform. It suggested that someone with such gifts had moved beyond the need for the basic disciplines that ordinary religious practiced. This was spiritual pride, disguised as acknowledgement of legitimate advancement, the most dangerous form of flattery because it contained truth that made the lie invisible. Teresa had indeed experienced extraordinary mystical phenomena that set her apart from most of her contemporaries. She had indeed demonstrated leadership and theological insight that influenced the entire Carmelite order. The demon took these genuine realities and twisted them into justification for relaxing the very disciplines that had created the conditions for those gifts to develop. It was suggesting she could maintain the fruits while abandoning the roots, that she had somehow graduated beyond the need for humility and self-denial that form the foundation of authentic spiritual life. The logic seemed almost reasonable. Surely someone who had proven themselves so thoroughly didn't need to keep proving it through suffering. The cell that had once felt like a sacred space of encounter with divine mystery now felt contaminated by a presence she was beginning to recognize as foreign and hostile. Teresa noticed that when the voice spoke, her prayers became more difficult, her concentration scattered, her sense of peace replaced by agitation disguised as excitement. The physical sensations accompanying these encounters were subtly wrong, a warmth that felt oily rather than clean, a comfort that left her feeling more hollow rather than filled, a relaxation that resembled numbness more than genuine rest. Her body was giving her information, her exhausted mind was struggling to process, warning signals that something in these interactions violated the natural order of spiritual experience. She began to notice details she had initially missed. The voice never encouraged her to seek counsel from her confessor, never suggested deeper prayer or more radical surrender to divine will, never led her toward greater love for others or more profound humility. Instead, every conversation seemed to circle back to the same themes: her exceptional status, the need for moderation, the possibility of achieving holiness through less demanding means. These patterns finally triggered recognition in Teresa's consciousness, a dawning horror as she realized she was being hunted. The turning point came during a night when the voice pushed too far, overplaying its hand in a moment of strategic miscalculation. It suggested that Teresa's visions and mystical experiences were proof that she had achieved such union with the divine that she could trust her own judgment above all external authorities, including the church hierarchy and her religious superiors. This was a bridge too far, a suggestion so antithetical to the foundations of Christian spirituality that it pierced through the fog of confusion that had been gathering in her mind. Teresa recognized in that instant the ultimate goal of the entire seduction: to isolate her completely from the body of Christ, to convince her that she alone possessed truth, to transform her humility into pride so absolute that she would become unteachable and unreachable. The demon had revealed itself through its ambition, pushing for total victory when patience would have served it better. She felt ice water cascade through her consciousness as the full architecture of the manipulation became visible, weeks of careful grooming designed to lead to this moment of supreme spiritual pride disguised as mystical advancement. Everything suddenly looked different, every previous conversation now obviously corrupted, every moment of comfort revealed as poison slowly administered. The recognition of what was happening created a moment of crystalline clarity in Teresa's mind, terror burning away the exhaustion that had made her vulnerable to begin with. She understood with sudden certainty that she was facing an intelligence that had studied human weakness for longer than human civilization had existed, an entity that knew exactly how to craft temptation specific to each individual soul. The demon had researched her life, her writings, her relationships, her hidden doubts and unspoken fears, constructing a campaign of seduction tailored with surgical precision to her particular vulnerabilities. This wasn't random spiritual warfare. This was targeted assassination of her vocation, and she had come terrifyingly close to cooperating in her own destruction. The voice continued speaking, still gentle, still reasonable, apparently unaware that its cover had been blown by its own overreach. Teresa felt her hands trembling as she knelt on the stone floor, every nerve in her body screaming that she was in the presence of something that wished her ultimate harm. The cell that had felt warm and comfortable now felt suffocating, the air thick with a presence that made her skin crawl with instinctive revulsion. The knowledge that came to her in that moment wasn't intellectual but visceral, a deep recognition that rose from the same place where genuine mystical experience originated. She understood that the demon's power over her existed only because she had been listening, because she had entertained the conversation, because she had allowed doubt to take root in her commitment to radical discipleship. The entity had no power to force her compliance. It could only seduce, suggest, manipulate through her own cooperation with its proposals. This realization was simultaneously terrifying and empowering. Terrifying because it revealed how much authority she had given to the voice simply by continuing to engage with it. Empowering because it meant she possessed the ability to withdraw that authority instantly and completely. The demon's sophisticated psychological warfare had created an illusion of inevitability, a sense that she was caught in a process she couldn't stop, but this was itself part of the deception. She could stop it. She had always possessed the power to stop it. She simply needed to exercise that authority with absolute conviction and zero negotiation. Teresa's response came not from theological sophistication or mystical experience, but from the simple, childlike faith that forms the foundation of authentic Christian spirituality. She didn't attempt to argue with the demon or match its intellectual arguments with superior reasoning. She didn't try to determine whether her assessment of the situation was correct through careful discernment. She simply spoke a single phrase that carried the weight of absolute authority, words so simple that a child could understand them, but so powerful that they shattered the entire architecture of seduction the demon had carefully constructed. Jesus Christ is Lord. These 4 words, spoken with every ounce of conviction in her being, functioned as a declaration of ultimate allegiance that left no room for negotiation or alternative authority. She wasn't casting out a demon through elaborate ritual or invoking complex theological formulas. She was simply stating the foundational truth of her existence, the bedrock reality upon which her entire life was built. In that phrase was contained her complete rejection of the voice's claims, her refusal to recognize any authority outside the one she had consecrated her life to serving. The effect was immediate and absolute, the presence that had filled her cell for weeks vanishing as though it had never existed, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt like falling into infinite space. Teresa gasped as the atmosphere shifted, the oppressive weight lifting from her chest, clean air suddenly filling her lungs after weeks of breathing, something subtly poisoned. The warmth that had felt comforting but wrong was replaced by the cold stone reality of her cell, and that cold felt like mercy, like truth, like home. She wept with a mixture of relief and horror, understanding how close she had come to complete spiritual destruction, how easily sophisticated manipulation could have led her to abandon everything she had built through years of difficult obedience. The tears came from some deep place within her that had been holding tension she hadn't fully recognized, the part of her that had known something was wrong even while the rest of her consciousness was being seduced. She remained on her knees for hours, not praying with words but simply existing in the presence of authentic divine silence, the kind that doesn't speak but simply is, holding rather than manipulating, loving rather than using. The documentation Teresa later created of this experience became crucial evidence for understanding the nature of sophisticated demonic attack, psychological warfare waged against those pursuing serious spiritual commitment. She wrote with clinical precision about the patterns of manipulation, the way the demon exploited her exhaustion and isolation, the subtle progression from comfort to compromise to potential destruction. Her account revealed that spiritual warfare doesn't always announce itself with obvious horror. Sometimes it comes dressed in reasonable suggestions, apparent wisdom, and the promise of an easier path to the same destination. She documented how the attack targeted her greatest strengths, her commitment, her mystical experiences, her leadership, turning them into potential sources of pride and isolation that could have destroyed her from within. The writings served as warning for future generations of spiritual seekers, a map of the territory where souls can lose their way even while believing they are advancing toward holiness. Teresa's willingness to document her own vulnerability with such honesty became one of her greatest gifts to the Church, proof that even the most advanced spiritual practitioners remain targets for sophisticated forms of spiritual warfare. The phrase she used to banish the demon became a cornerstone of her later spiritual direction, advice she gave to others facing similar attacks. Jesus Christ is Lord functioned not as magical incantation, but as declaration of ultimate reality, a refusal to negotiate with any voice claiming authority over the human soul, except the one to whom she had consecrated her entire existence. The simplicity of the phrase contained profound theological truth. Sovereignty belongs to Christ alone. No other voice carries ultimate authority. No argument or suggestion from any source, human or demonic, can override the foundational commitment to follow him regardless of cost. Teresa taught that when facing spiritual confusion, elaborate discernment isn't always necessary or even helpful. Sometimes the appropriate response is the simplest possible declaration of loyalty, spoken with absolute conviction, allowing no room for compromise or negotiation. This wasn't about the specific words, but about the decisive act of choosing allegiance, of drawing a line that said this far and no further, to any influence attempting to redirect her spiritual journey away from radical discipleship. The cell remained her sacred space, but forever after carried the memory of that battle, a reminder that the spiritual life involves warfare most people never witness or understand. Teresa emerged from the experience with deeper humility about her own vulnerability and clearer vision about the nature of genuine spiritual progress. She understood that mystical gifts and religious leadership don't create immunity from attack. If anything, they make the soul a more valuable target for entities seeking to corrupt the work of divine love in the world. The demon's whisper had been sophisticated precisely because she was worth the effort of sophisticated attack, a realization that was simultaneously humbling and affirming. She never forgot how easily she had been led toward the edge of spiritual disaster, how reasonable the destructive path had seemed while she was walking it, how liberation came not through her own wisdom, but through returning to the simple foundational truth she had known since childhood. The experience transformed her ministry, making her infinitely more compassionate toward others, facing spiritual confusion, while also more fierce in her insistence on the disciplines that create conditions for authentic growth. She had learned that the path to holiness passes through genuine humility, that there are no shortcuts available that don't ultimately lead to destruction. and that the most dangerous attacks come wrapped in comfort and whispered with apparent care.